Okay, so thanks everyone for joining me. I am going to talk about Open Source Companies 101. So I'm going to cover sort of like really basic theory of both defining what an open source company is and sort of the basic fundamental idea behind building one. This is basic stuff, but I thought that it was a good way, and I think other people agreed, to start off this track, because if we're going to talk about building open source companies, then we need to agree, A, on what that is, and B, on sort of the fundamental idea behind building an open source company, and what the sort of common threads are between all open source companies. That's what I'm going to cover. Before I start, I'm going to introduce myself just a little bit. I'll skip over the stuff that Matt talked about, but also I'll talk really briefly about the Open Source Founders Summit, because as part of organizing this, I've actually put a lot of thought into what is an open source company, because if you're organizing an event that's specifically about business for founders of open source companies, and like we're doing, making sure to only include open source founders, you have to have sort of a line around what constitutes an open source company and what doesn't. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about what is an open source company. Now, I do not expect every single person to agree with my definition, but this is what I think of when I think of an open source company. First of all, it's a company that contributes significantly to one or several projects with an OSI-approved license. So the OSI-approved license is the black and white part. The contributes significantly part, that's a little bit more subjective, but the point is they have to be a software editor. They have to actually be contributing to a project. The second one is that the business is sort of fundamentally dependent on this open source project, on the relationship with this open source project. So if the open source project goes away, the business is either really fundamentally altered or it can't exist anymore. It's extremely fundamental to the company. And then the third one, I actually haven't seen other people bring this up before, but it is important in the context of open source. The company is for profit, and the people running the company have profit as their goal. So you will see a lot of efforts to monetize open source projects that are organized as a nonprofit organization. I think that's interesting. We can argue about, is that a business model or not? To me, fundamentally, if you are running a business, that means that you're looking for profit. So an organization or a foundation or a nonprofit is just, it's a different model, but it's not a business. Okay, so open source companies are diverse. This is also, in my opinion, something that gets lost in a lot of conversations. So there are one-person open source companies. There are individuals who maintain a project, have monetized the project, and they sell something. Maybe it's a service. Maybe they have a commercial product that's related to it. This is an open source company if it meets all of those criteria. There are open source companies that are 2,000, 3,000 person as well. So they're all sizes. They make all different kinds of products. So in a lot of places, there's a lot of focus on the dev tools, on open source companies that are making projects for developers, but that is far from all open source companies. There's also open source companies that are bootstrapped. Like if you have that one-person company, it's probably going to be a bootstrapped company. And then, of course, there's also VC-backed open source companies. And they're also all over the world. So again, we tend to talk a lot about the companies that are in San Francisco or that are in London, but there are open source companies that meet all three of my criteria. They're really all over the world, including in a lot of places that we do not generally think about when we think about tech companies. So let's talk a little bit about some of the shades of gray here. I think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of subjectivity in some of the definitions. One thing that comes up is, does the company have to be the project maintainer, or does the company have to be led by the core maintainers of the project? I tend to think no. And there are definitely some companies out there that I think meet the criteria for an open source company who are not project maintainers. And then, of course, obviously, there's companies that were the project maintainer and then they donate the project to a foundation, and that means they're going to lose a certain amount of control. But there are also companies that contribute substantially to a project, that are fundamentally dependent on that project as part of their business, who did not start and have never been maintainers of the project. And then the last point is, what exactly does it mean for the open source project to be critical? And this is something that I think is really open to discussion. I mean, it sort of makes it not the best definition, but if something is really critical, to me it just means that the business would have a fundamentally different model if the open source project were to go away. But let's be totally honest, any open source company could decide that they're going to abandon the open source model in the future. So, like, what exactly does this mean, that the open source project is critical? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe it's kind of like a you know it when you see it situation. Okay, let's move on and talk about some really basics for how to build an open source company. It's actually really simple. The like foundational theory of building an open source company is super simple. So step one, you have to have a project that provides value. The project has to do something that's valuable. I didn't actually mention this in my definition of what an open source company is, but there's a lot of companies out there that have some open source components, but their SDK is open source, for example. But there's no way that you would use that SDK if you were not also a commercial customer of that company. So that, to me, does not fit the definition of an open source company. So your open source project has to provide value in and of itself for people who do not have any kind of commercial relationship with your company. And then the second piece, extremely important, you have to have a commercial offering of some kind that provides additional value that goes above and beyond whatever it is that your project delivers. And it has to be something that people are willing to pay for. I mean, there's all sorts of values that you could provide that maybe people are not going to pay for. But this is actually really hard to put into practice. And I also think a lot of people sort of lose sight of this sort of fundamental philosophy of what it means to build an open source company. What types of open source companies are there out there? So I specifically didn't say that you need to build a product that delivers additional value. I said a commercial offering, because I think that offering support and or services on top of an open source project is a valid business model. And you can have a valid open source company that meets all the criteria and provides support and services. That's your commercial offering. That is a type of open source companies. There's also open source companies that have a cloud product or a SaaS product that package together and manage the open source projects. You can have an enterprise distribution of some kind that your customers are going to run on-prem. You can have a complementary open source and commercial product. I think that's actually really interesting, where you have an open source project that delivers outcome X, and you have a commercial product that delivers outcome Y, and they're complementary. So all of your all of your commercial customers are also open source users. I think that that's a model that's really interesting, personally. So one of the difficulties actually in talking about open source companies is that the strategy that you're going to follow and the business model that you're going to follow is very different if you have a SaaS model or if you are providing services and support. So when people talk about, like, here's a playbook for open source companies, I actually don't think that that's really valid, because you have to say, like, here's a playbook for building a SaaS product as an open source company, because the models are just so different. If you want to have a really, like, clear, inclusive view of all open source companies, you can't have just one playbook. But let's talk about some fallacies about open source companies. And again, these are things that I think pretty much apply to all open source companies. People often think that you will be able to convert X% of your project users to paid customers. Now, depending on who you're talking to, the actual number that X represents might be different. But the truth is, in most cases, you won't find like a very clear correlation between community growth and commercial growth. It's not just like if we add 100 community users, we're going to convert one of them to our commercial offering. Often that's not how it works, and the reason is because project market fit does not equal product market fit. You have a different audience for your project than you do for your product, or I should say your commercial offering. So just because you have massive community traction doesn't necessarily mean you have like a slam dunk, profitable, amazing company. The last one, sometimes I feel like is like an undertone in discussions about open source businesses. Sometimes people seem to think that open source companies are ethically superior to closed source companies. I actually don't think that that's the case. I think open source is a model. There are reasons for building an open source company, but I don't think that they're necessarily like better. It doesn't make you a better person to build an open source company versus to build a closed source company. I have more of these. I think it's also wrong to think that you have to have a super engaged open source community in order to build an open source company. So the way that an open source project can contribute business value to your company are different. There's different models, and in some of those models, the engagement that you have in your community is really irrelevant. So sometimes the reason that having an open source project is really important is for transparency. So you're going to end up having a lot of easier time getting people to sign contracts with you because they're able to examine your code, because they understand the license structure. And yes, there are other ways to get around this, like allowing people to keep your code in escrow, for example, in case you go under. But it is usually much simpler to get something through a legal department if you just say, look, this is open source. You know what open source means. We don't have to educate you about our like specific, this specific fancy license that you've never heard of. This is just open source. Here's what it means. Let's push this through. So in cases like that, where the reason that being open source is important is related to transparency and the ability to convince your customers that your code does what you say it does and doesn't do the things that you say it doesn't do, your open source adoption is kind of irrelevant. They don't care. Another fallacy is that in all open source companies, it always starts with an open source project and then you add the commercial offering later. There's a lot of companies where that didn't happen, where they started with a commercial offering of some kind, and then later decided that open source was a good approach for whatever reason, and so open sourced a big chunk of their source code. That happens, and it happens for a variety of reasons. It's just a mistake to think that all open source companies follow exactly the same trajectory. And then the last one, I also think it is a mistake to say that open source is always the best option in terms of the best business option. So there are also some people out there who will say that open source is always the best business model. I don't think that that's true. I think that there are real business reasons to have a significant portion of your code base be open source, but it is not appropriate in all cases. And when you're building a company, you should really think through, is this, given my specific business, given the things that my specific software or my specific commercial offering does, is an open source approach most appropriate in this case? It isn't always. Okay, so let's talk briefly about some of the challenges that I think all open source companies share, like the common threads. The first one is that there's always going to be a tension between your product or your commercial offering and your project. This is because you're going to have to define you have to divide your resources between those two things. This is true if you have services. This is true if you have a product. But also because there's always the risk that you can make your project too awesome. If you give too much away, you will cripple your ability to make money. And again, this is true no matter what model you're following. And so this creates a tension, right? Because you have to create value that people really appreciate with your project, but you also have to make sure that there's still some value that you can capture. And that goes back to that really fundamental idea of what an open source company is, and it's really hard to do in practice. You always have to manage the project-product relationship. So this is about communicating for yourself and for other people what the difference is between your project and your commercial offering. I have an example here that I think is good from DBT Labs, which sort of illustrates how the outcome is different between their open source and their product. And that's the key, is that you have to be really clear about what the difference in outcome and the difference in persona, the difference in use case between your open source project and your commercial offering. The next thing is that you can't be just doing your open source software for fun. If you are in this to build a business and your business has limited resources, which even if you have like massive amounts of venture funding, your resources are still limited, you can't be doing stuff that's just a charity or that's just for fun. So you have to understand, how is your open source project contributing to actual business outcomes? And there's a menu of ways that the open source can provide business outcomes, but it's not the same for every single company. So you have to be clear on that. You have to measure, and you have to be willing to change things if you feel like, in this case, your open source project is not pulling its own weight. Okay, this is also a really big deal in open source companies. A lot of people will start an open source project because they're unhappy about how expensive the alternatives are. But if the main value that people get out of your project compared to everyone else is that it's free, it's going to be really hard to actually make money on that later on. So you want to make sure that there are other things, there's other differentiators between your project and the alternatives. Even, I do not encourage anyone to compete on price, but it is better to at least say we're cheaper than the alternatives than we're free. Okay, so I touched on this briefly, but this is a big challenge. Your ideal user and your ideal customer are not the same, so you're going to have to manage the relationship between the personas in your user base and in your community and your ICPs for potential commercial customers. These are sort of the different ways that those communities can overlap. Sometimes it looks like a target, sometimes it looks like a Venn diagram, sometimes it just looks like two circles. I actually think if it just looks like two circles, you need to fix something. That's not a good strategy. It's more common to have a Venn diagram or a target. And I actually think of those three, the one that you're going for is the Venn diagram, not the target. You notice, of course, this is kind of stating the obvious, that the ideal customer profile is always smaller. Just keeping that in mind. That is absolutely true for pretty much every open source company. Okay, so to recap really quickly, an open source company is a for-profit entity that has a critical relationship to an open source project. And the basic idea behind building an open source company is to build a project that provides value and a commercial offering that builds additional value that people are willing to pay for. And that is it. I have a free ebook that's about positioning for free open source projects, not for companies, but for free projects. There's my podcast, my website. Send me an email if you have questions. And if you have questions and you want to ask them right now, I think we have time, but I'm not sure. Okay, cool.